Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Korea Society. It's a great pleasure and honor to introduce our two panelists and moderator today. But before I do that, I'd also like to welcome two distinguished guests in the audience, Ambassador Kim, the General Counsel here from Korea, and also Ambassador Takahashi, General Counsel for Japan. And then I noticed we have a number of board members, so thank you for showing up this morning. This morning we have a special program in many ways, not just in the presenters, but in that we are collaborating with the Bush Center, whose support to the mission of the Korea Society is greatly appreciated. I think you all know well our guests, our distinguished guests, so please let me highlight just several items in their careers. Victor Cha. He is the Senior Advisor and Korea Chair at CSIS. He's also a Professor and Director of Asian Studies at Georgetown School of Foreign Service. He has won the Human Freedom, he's a Human Freedom Fellow at the George W. Bush Institute, served as Director for Asian Affairs on the NSC for President Bush, was Deputy Head of Delegation for the U.S. at the Six-Party Talks in Beijing, and received 2 outstanding service commendations during his tenure at the NSC. Dr. Cha's recent book talk at the Korea Society was given in October. He was here, Power Play, Origins of the American Alliance System in Asia. And I like to conclude by saying Dr. Cha began his distinguished career by serving as an intern at the Korea Society when he was a student at Columbia. Ambassador Robert Gallucci is a consultant to the George W. Bush Institute for George W. Bush Institute's North Korean Initiative. He was a distinguished professor in the practice of diplomacy at the Georgetown University School of Foreign Service. Was the dean of the School of Foreign Service at Georgetown for 13 years. Was the president of the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. He also was President Clinton's chief U.S. negotiator during the North Korean nuclear crisis back in 1994. And he served as a deputy executive chairman of the UN Special Commission, overseeing the disarmament of Iraq following the first Gulf War. Lindsay Lloyd, our moderator, is the deputy director for human freedom at the George W. Bush Institute. Currently leads the Bush Institute's Freedom in North Korea project, and at the International Republican Institute was senior advisor for policy. So thank you, Lindsay, and Robert and Victor, please.
Thank you very much. Good morning. On 2 notes, I'd like to say thank you for the warm welcome. First of all, for the drubbing you gave to the Cowboys last night, and secondly, for this beautiful Texas weather you got going outside here. So thank you all very much. Great start. As Tom said, I'm with the George W. Bush Institute. We're based in Dallas. For those of you who may not know us, we are a public policy institute, a nonprofit, non-governmental institution. We're located on the campus of Southern Methodist University. And we work on policy priorities that were important to George and Laura Bush throughout their careers. Broadly speaking, we work to develop leaders to advance policies and to find solutions to some of the most pressing problems out there. Specifically, we work on military service, which is programs for veterans who have returned home, education reform, economic growth, a women's initiative, which works to empower women to get into public policy in the Middle East, and the area that I work on, the Human Freedom Initiative. Human freedom, broadly speaking, is democracy and human rights. We've been working on the North Korea issue now for about 2.5 years. We started in 2014 for 2 main reasons. First of all, that was the year that the UN Commission of Inquiry report came out and really cast a spotlight on the human rights issues in North Korea. And secondly, it marked the 10th anniversary of the North Korea Human Rights Act. This is a law that President Bush signed into law in 2004, has been reauthorized twice, will be reauthorized again next year, we assume, which did a number of things, but it created a pathway for North Korean refugees to come to the United States. It created the Office of the Special Envoy for North Korean Human Rights. It also provided support and funding for some initiatives to bring more information into North Korea. So we began working on that, doing a number of different things. We've done original research, including public opinion polling of what the U.S. population knows about North Korea. Not very much was the one-line conclusion there. We've done 2 studies of North Korean refugees who've come to the United States. There are about 200 refugees that have come over the last decade or so. We've commissioned 2 policy papers, and most importantly, we've gone out and found good talent. And these 2 gentlemen here are the best examples of that. Bob Gallucci and Victor Cha recently wrote a new paper for us looking at North Korea policy in the next administration. I think it's safe to say that on day one, on January 20th, one of the top issues in the in-basket for the president-elect is going to be North Korea. So maybe just to start off, Victor, can you maybe just recap sort of where we've been over the last few years in terms of North Korea, particularly on the human rights front, and then Bob maybe chime in on the security front.
Sure. So for, I would say, decades, the human rights abuses in North Korea were known to many, but not really acted on by many. I think one of the first reports came out in the 1970s by a group of lawyers, human rights lawyers in Minnesota, first report in English. So this has been a longstanding issue for decades. And we really didn't see a change until 2014, as you mentioned, when the UN Commission of Inquiry issued a report, a comprehensive report about human rights abuses in North Korea. The primary recommendation of which was that they recommended that the UN Security Council take those responsible in North Korea to the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. The term crimes against humanity, of course, is about the strongest language that the UN can use in terms of human rights abuses. And that really started a groundswell of international interest, awareness about the issue. And in the United States, this also happened, but it was preceded by a series of actions that were taken during President Bush's term in office. The Congress was very active in terms of the Human Rights Act, North Korean Human Rights Act, North Korea Freedom Week in Washington, D.C., the appointing of a special envoy for human rights, and then the first, outside of South Korea, the first ever refugee resettlement program in the United States. And I think for the most part, this issue, I think, is now on the radar screen. One of the reasons we wrote the report was that we don't think it can be divorced from the security issues as it has been in the past. And it has been, I would say, not just for the most part, but entirely a bipartisan issue. There is, in all of our meetings on the Hill that Lindsay and I have done, there's really been no disagreement at all about the priority that this issue has in policy towards North Korea, both for the international community and for the United States.
Mm-hmm. What's been happening on the security front? It's a lot of good news, right?
That's why we're here.
Yeah,
to celebrate. Lindsay, I was just calculating as I was listening to Victor. If one thinks back 25 years in where we were with North Korea, we were watching a regime. I think that in human rights terms, it looks familiar. But in terms of the threat they posed to the United States and its allies, it doesn't look familiar. Because at that point, it was a conventional threat, not involving ballistic missiles, mostly involving artillery along the DMZ. And we were worried about the possibility of some incident along the DMZ or at sea escalating into another Korean War. And we were at the same time looking at a very nascent nuclear weapons program, a plutonium production program. So that in 1992, to be precise, when George Herbert Walker Bush engaged the North Koreans here in New York City with his Undersecretary of State, Arnie Cantor, the whole idea was, could you stop this plutonium program? Well, we've come a long way. And right now, what we were worried would happen by 2000, we're now fairly certain, unless something happens to prevent it, is going to happen by 2020. By the end of this administration is when the new one coming in, for example. So we will be looking at judging by North Korea nuclear weapons tests and judging by ballistic missile tests. We're looking at a North Korea in a few years that will have the capability to reach continental United States with an intercontinental ballistic missile, perhaps a submarine-launched ballistic missile, with a nuclear weapon. And that will be a material change in the character of the threat. Some people believe that everything will change when the North Koreans can do that, and others of us have a little more faith in deterrence. But in any case, it will be new. The recent activity, Lindsay, that I think you'd want everybody to focus on, is in the area of ballistic missiles and nuclear weapons and this growing capability. Plus, I would say, in the hands of a leadership that we don't have much reason to believe accepts the assumptions of deterrence that have guided the United States and the Soviet Union, and now the United States and Russia, all those years. In other words, we should not be relaxed, I don't think, and take as an assumption that North Korea now, with this leadership, accepts what we regard as deterrence. Another way of putting that, turning that around, is I don't know personally what the North Koreans think these nuclear weapons that they have built, and we think there are somewhere between 8 and 12 or so now, and moving towards maybe 100, what Kim Jong-un thinks these weapons are good for. What does he think they deter? What adventures does he believe he can launch without response from either Seoul or Washington? I know, based upon the way we think about the utility of nuclear weapons, that these weapons are not good for much. The question is, what does he think? It's much more important than what I think. Similarly, once the North is capable of reaching the United States with an ICBM, and that they would have confidence in, unless we have very high confidence we can intercept that ICBM, then again the question is asked, what is that capability good for from the North Korean perspective? Mm-hmm. So I think if we were now briefing a new administration coming in, we would want to point, I think, to this. There's a lot for us to talk about this morning, but I think I'd want to start there, the character of the threat. Mm-hmm. And also, at least for me, my ignorance about what this means for North Koreans. Because depending on what it means, what we think it means, it implies some planning on our part with our allies.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think that's an interesting point that you raise, that basically if you've got a state that doesn't accept the rules in terms of international affairs, international politics, nuclear politics, and so on, the link that you've drawn in the paper is basically this is a state that doesn't respect the rules at home either in terms of human rights. And you draw a link between North Korea's human rights abuses and their security policies, writing that freedom and security are essentially indivisible. Can you address that? Are they genuinely linked? Is there a link between the two?
Well, I think at the first cut, one of the links is something that you've already mentioned, Lindsay, which is that the United States has done a couple of agreements, arguably 2.5 agreements, with the North Koreans, all of which have fallen apart. And it does raise the question about whether it is possible that a regime that treats its people as poorly as it does could be expected to keep agreements with countries outside and in its neighborhood. So I think that's a very fair question that one could ask. At the second level, I think there's pretty good evidence suggesting that some of the revenues from North Korean human rights abuses, whether it is in the coal mining industry or in the export of groups of laborers abroad to work in countries at standards that do not meet ILO, International Labor Organization standards, whether the revenues from these sorts of things are fed back into the state and are used for either proliferation or for the development of the nuclear programs or other sorts of weapons programs inside of the country. There's still a lot of research being done on this question, but the fact that the latest UN Security Council resolutions are going after not just things that we know to be proliferation financing activities by either state-run companies or front companies that are organized by the state. But the fact that they are also going after exports of coal and minerals out of North Korea, I think is a sign that we see these things as also being directly linked to the regime's proliferation activity.
So, as I listen to Victor, I find myself thinking this is a persuasive case for the connection of the nuclear weapons proliferation issue and the human rights issue. But I do come at this from a different perspective. I think we end up in pretty much the same place, which is why we could write one article and not two. But I start from the nuclear weapons part of this equation. And these days, I am most often confronted with the proposition that North Korea will never give up its nuclear weapons. People like to say that. I'm not sure why people are so enthusiastic about saying that. It is true that North Koreans say that. I get that. But I don't necessarily believe it. I mean, I was told when we were negotiating all those years ago, decades ago, they would never give up their plutonium reactors. They had one operating and two under construction, and they said, why would they give up these reactors? Well, they did give up those reactors. Now, I'm not going to replay history, but my only point so far is that there's no reason to take North Korea at its word that they'll never give up their nuclear weapons. Right? I think it's a better question to ask is, under what circumstances might North Korea be persuaded to give up their weapons? Having asked North Koreans that question, I am persuaded that their weapons program is largely driven by a concern for their own security and regime survival, that the principal threat that they see comes from the United States of America, that they play a little fast and loose with history, but they see the United States having acted in other countries, and they have named Iraq and Libya, and they talk about American foreign policy, and they say, we cannot be sure of our own position vis-a-vis the United States and what the United States' intentions are unless we have a deterrent. So we need these nuclear weapons forever. All right. So that leads me to ask the question, the circumstance under which you'd be prepared to give up these weapons is if your security needs were met by other means then. And they ask, well, what would that be? That would be a new political relationship with the United States of America, where you believed that we were not enemies anymore. There was no rationale or reason to suspect the United States of overthrowing the regime in Pyongyang any more than we would overthrow the regime in Seoul. Right? This is not plausible. Could we get to that situation? What would it take to address your security concerns? It would be a new political relationship. Then ask the question, what would it take for the United States and the DPRK to have a new political relationship? The answer is, among other things, a basis for that relationship that includes a human rights policy in the North that meets basic international standards. So for me, and I might come at this from the nuclear weapons perspective, and where I want to get to is the DPRK as a non-nuclear weapon state again, I cannot see getting there through a negotiating process as opposed to images that some people have of regime collapse or a catastrophic war on the peninsula. If we are still talking about negotiation, I don't see a way to that outcome that does not include a major adjustment in the way the government in the DPRK treats its own people.
Mm-hmm. Victor, you think it's fair to say the conversation has changed on this issue in Washington over the last few years?
I think so. I think the United States rightly, the government, previous administrations rightly have been focused on the nuclear issue, the nuclear threat as the first priority. But I think we've seen over the course of the various agreements that these negotiations reach a point and then they hit a wall. Like Bob said, we don't want to rehash history. People can blame all sorts of different parties for this, but in the end, there seemed to be a limit to how far we can go. And I think part of the answer to going beyond that is what Bob has referred to. It's not just, the scope of the agreement has to get broader for the North Koreans to feel like they can make the so-called strategic decision that everybody's been wanting them to make. And that includes, by necessity, the political relationship, political normalization, peace treaty, those sorts of things. And I think it's very hard to imagine any of those things happening, particularly today, after the UN Commission of Inquiry report and the awareness on the human rights issue. It's difficult for me to imagine that happening today without some addressing of this issue. And I think, while it's not a question of regime change or anything of that nature, if you had a North Korean regime that was enmeshed in a denuclearization agreement, and at the same time was improving its human rights record, was complying at least with the basic minimum of international human rights standards, that would in effect be a change of the regime. That would be a very significant change of the regime.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, how do we get there? How does the new president get there? Is there a pathway to opening talks, to opening negotiations with the North?
I think it is at least plausible that the DPRK will avoid ballistic missiles and ballistic missile or nuclear weapons tests in the early days of a Trump administration. I think it's at least plausible. I think it's at least plausible that a new Trump administration would avoid immediately rushing to see what new sanctions might be applied to Pyongyang. And I think if both those steps were avoided by Pyongyang and Washington respectively, that it is then plausible, far from guaranteed, but again plausible, that the president, who I believe would not shrink from the designation of negotiator-in-chief, would see value in exploring negotiations with the North. I wouldn't be surprised if the North didn't have an agenda that could be advanced by these negotiations. I want to add very quickly that I would hope that the North there wouldn't be any poison pills in the North's position, such as, you must understand that we'll negotiate, but we will never give up our nuclear weapons program. It would be very useful if they did not say that. Mm-hmm. From my perspective, once they say that, negotiations become problematic. For me, I see that as provocative in Seoul and in Tokyo, and legitimizing of a nuclear weapons program. And so I worry about that, and I would like them to avoid that formulation. I don't delude myself to think that there's a shortcut to non-nuclear North Korea, but there may be a long cut that involves some important steps, freezes of tests, no fissile material production. We can make that stuff up. But if people are reasonable about this, then I could imagine anyway, a basis for discussions. And I don't see a great deal of upside to simply continuing containment and then worrying about whether we have to adopt a preemption posture to deal with a new emerging threat in 4 years or 3 years or whatever it is. Now, I'm not pleased about that thought. And from the North's perspective, I don't think things get dramatically better by their continued isolation, because if what we're talking about now doesn't happen, I would be surprised if there wasn't a visit by a representative of the negotiator chief in Beijing looking to put more pressure on the North, which can't be what Pyongyang most hopes for. Anyway, this is, I've made all this up, but I think there's something to it.
Victor, you agree? Do we have a window here?
I think, let me say something that I think is mostly in agreement with Bob, but in different words. So, I think that there are two constants going forward, right? And one of the constants is I think there will be an inclination for all the parties involved, the United States as well as all the other countries involved, to let the sanctions move forward or play out. And now, and for many of you who've covered this issue or follow this issue, that may sound very familiar. I think the only thing I think is a little bit different now is we have 2321, the UN Security Council resolution, in which China is committed to cutting these coal exports, right, by as much as 60%, $600, $700 million per year. So we have that. That's new. The other thing that's fairly new is the Treasury sanction, the Section 311 designation of the entire jurisdiction of North Korea as an arena of primary money laundering concern was a designation that Treasury had put out 30 or 60 days ago. But there was a 30, and I can't remember, someone in the audience, there's a 30 or 60-day comment period before it goes into effect. And we've reached that point now. So I think one of the constants going forward is that many of the parties, I think, will want to allow these new sets of sanctions to work and see, because they arguably are a step above what we've seen thus far. The other thing that I think is relatively constant is I think that they will do a provocation. And the reason I feel that way has a lot to do with the data that we've been collecting on North Korean behavior at CSIS, where we have found that North Korea, on average, operates within a provocation window around U.S. elections, U.S. presidential elections and by-elections of about 1 month. So 1 month before and 1 month after U.S. presidential elections or by-elections, you can be pretty certain North Korea is going to do something. And prior to the election here, they did 2 MRBM tests that failed. The only reason they have not done anything after, that we know of, after the election is because of what was happening in South Korea. The political crisis in South Korea. And for the North Koreans, they probably thought, well, maybe we won't do a test right now because why should we give President Park any help, right, in terms of consolidating support. Now that the impeachment vote has happened, the court's got a rule on it. I think it's entirely possible. We've now gone back into this window, and I think they could do something around the time of President-elect Trump's inauguration. Those are the two constants. Here are the two variables, right? The two variables are, first, on the North Korean side, it's entirely possible that they could couple more provocations, again, designed to show strength, position of strength to the new Trump administration. They could couple that with a diplomatic act. There's been a U.S. university student that's been held in North Korea now for nearly 1 year, and nobody's been able to see him. Right? It's entirely possible the North could do that too. So that's the variable. And then the other variable in terms of, on the U.S. side, is President Trump himself. We don't know how he's going to react to another provocation or even an act of diplomacy. It's entirely possible that he could be of the view that we need to continue to press as hard as we can, or he could be of the view that I've negotiated tougher things than this. I can do this. Right? So we don't know. The one thing I would say is that regardless of these constants and the variables, I think almost certainly the next U.S. administration is going to have to be willing to accept more risk in its policy towards North Korea and the Korean Peninsula. Just because the situation, as Bob described at the very beginning, is much worse than when he negotiated in 1994, and it's much worse than when I was part of the negotiation team in 2006. And that means that there's going to have to be more risk that the next administration accepts. That can be more risk in terms of diplomacy, being willing to cross lines that we haven't been willing to cross before. It could mean a risk in terms of military assets, deployments to the peninsula, or it could mean risk in terms of other things like our relationship with China, in the sense that to put more pressure on China and to leverage the U.S.-China relationship. So, so I think we're in the same place, but there are a lot of variables out there, not the least of which is how President Trump himself will see this problem.
Yeah, well, I mean, on that note, on China in particular, we're at an interesting phase, I guess you could say, with the president-elect's phone call with the president of Taiwan. Where is China on this? Is there any prospect for China working with us, for us working with China on this?
We should ban the use of the word interesting.
Yeah, okay. Challenging,
yeah.
bizarre.
So, and a word on Victor's comments. I think if I were a betting man, or make this personal, one could lose a lot of money underestimating North Korea's capacity for doing self-destructive things. So I agree with Victor that that's certainly possible. The China issue, I mean, partly, this is there's another little-known NGO in this town called the Council on Foreign Relations, and they did a report recently on North Korea, and I was struck by the weight they put on China as an actor here that I don't want to say could pull our chestnuts out of the fire, but sort of a real major role in solving this problem. And I think, having been sent to Beijing a number of times when I was negotiating with the DPRK to get the Chinese, quote, to do more, close quote, and that was a long time ago. I know there's been much water under the bridge and over the dam since then, but I think fundamentally, in terms of the international system, international structure, U.S. interest in the Asia-Pacific region, we should want China to be helpful, and we should do what we can to persuade China to do its part to get the DPRK to do what's necessary to defuse what is growing to be a conventional and potential nuclear crisis on their doorstep in Northeast Asia. They bear some responsibility here, given their role with respect to sanctions and their relationship, unique relationship with Pyongyang. I understand that, and I think it's right to press them on this. I don't think it is right, likely to be effective, or even prudent for the United States to subcontract, a word I've been using here on this, to subcontract the North Korea issue, arguably the major, although we're working on Taiwan now, the major security issue outstanding in the Asia-Pacific region between the United States and China. We shouldn't be subcontracting that issue to our near-peer rival. We should take responsibility. I think our allies expect us to. I think the rest of the region hopes we will. So, yes, I think we should press them to play a role, but at the end of the day, I don't think we can slip this punch. I think we have to deal with this. I don't see a solution that's possible without Beijing, but I'm not enthusiastic about evolving that proposition into one in which we subside and they come forward.
You agree, Victor?
Yeah, I do agree with that. I think there is, as Bob has, I've been in many of these meetings with the Chinese, and much as one would like to see them as a partner in this, they're not a partner like Japan and Korea are a partner in this. My concern with China's position is that China has already made its strategic decision on North Korea, which is that a collapse or instability of the regime is not in China's short-term, medium-term, or long-term interest. That is the strategic decision. We always talk about trying to get China to make a different strategic decision, but I think they've made that strategic decision. And then all of the talks and negotiations with China just ends up being about tactics. You know, can you cut 50% of coal, 60%, 70, oh, 70 is too much? Okay, 65, no, 60, all right, 60%. And then once China makes that decision, then the opposite reflex kicks in, which is then they push the United States to go back to talks. So, and that is almost, I mean, that pretty much encapsulates the negotiation with China. On the one hand, we want them to press harder. They play hard to get. When they finally agree to press more, then the quid pro quo is, all right, you must go back to talks, because in the end, that's how China gets stability in the situation without it unraveling into a crisis. Now, does that mean the Chinese are not concerned about the current situation? They are very concerned about the current situation, and they are very worried that it could get worse. I think for that reason, they agreed to this rather dramatic cut in coal exports, coal imports from, and mineral imports from North Korea. But if you were to ask me now to be a Chinese official in Beijing, from my perspective, I would not then say the ball is now in the U.S. court. That the United States needs to go back to a negotiation. So I'm entirely in agreement with Bob on this. I think I cannot imagine, as Bob said, a solution, an agreement to this that would not involve China. But our interests do not, ours meaning the United States, South Korea, and Japan, do not overlap uniformly with China on this issue. There is a narrow overlap that is largely defined as maintaining stability, but outside of that, there's not much of an overlap.
Victor, at the beginning, you talked a little bit about this being a rare issue where you have Republican and Democratic members of Congress, senators, representatives being basically in agreement. How does Congress's attitude on this potentially affect the actions of the incoming administration?
Well, I think Congress has been a very active and effective player on North Korea policy. I think, you know, over the last 5 or 6 years. I mean, of course, the legislating of the North Korean Freedom Act was Human Rights Act was a big part of this. But also, they have really been taking the lead on legislating a lot of these new sanctions that have taken place against North Korea, not least of which was the OFAC designation of the North Korean leader for human rights abuses. So I think their role is quite important. As you said, Lindsay, next year will be the re-upping of the North Korean Human Rights Act. And I think there is a lot that could be done to enhance and empower the act, in part because it's been, you know, it's been almost a decade since it was first legislated, and technology has changed. There's more of a commitment, I think, politically. So I think there's a great potential for this to be an even stronger act than it has been in the past. So I think Congress plays a very important role. I think there is really bipartisan support for this. I mean, one of the reasons that we did this report together was we wanted to show that there was a path that encompassed both security issues and human rights, written by two people who had served in different administrations and had worked very hard on these issues. There is a path that all of us can go on in terms of this, and I think that's what the report showed.
Yeah, and it's not, Bob, it's not just on the human rights issue where Congress has been an engine propelling this. It's also been on the security front, right?
Yes, I'm aware of the concern on the Hill over the nuclear weapons and ballistic missile programs, and sanctions that flow from those programs. And if you catch a certain hesitation in my voice, it is because whenever one thinks of this as a negotiator, one wants sanctions in place, and one wants also for those sanctions to be open to manipulation, so that one can go to a table not only with sticks but also with carrots, to use the overused metaphor, which I'm told states really do not like. That puts them in the role of donkey, and no state really likes that. But I think what I'm getting to here is that yes, I think the committees are seized with this issue, certain members more than others, and that what this says to me, based upon some personal experience, but also watching this for longer, and then the decade that Victor was involved and I wasn't, is to stay close to members of Congress as you proceed with a North Korea policy. That if it is an article of faith in any administration to consult closely with one's allies, and particularly here I'm talking about Seoul and Tokyo, that consultation at home, I mean, you raise the Congress issue, but that's going to be critical too, for any negotiator to be sufficiently light on his or her feet to get something done.
Right, and to sell the deal, essentially, if a deal can be had. Let's turn. We're going to go to audience questions in just a minute, but I just want to kind of walk you through. There are two sets of recommendations that came out in the policy paper. 9 on the security front, 9 on the human rights front, and I don't know. You want to pick one or two out and maybe talk about why those are important on the security front?
I mean, I want to link these things. Let's take the top one first, because that's the least happy in a way. One of the things I said, we are moving to a period which we should expect the North Korea's capabilities to increase, and the capability, the ability to reach the United States with an ICBM armed with a nuclear weapon should lead us, and by us I mean the United States and its allies, into close consultations about what's a proper response to that. And in the first instance, the sustained deterrence and reassure allies. The alternative to that is to fail at reassuring allies, so that those in Seoul and Tokyo decide that they can't rely on the extended deterrent of the United States of America. Once the United States of America is vulnerable, its cities are vulnerable to attack, then the alliance is fractured. All right. I believe our position should be analogous to what it's been in Europe, dealing with a Soviet Union that had far more missiles and warheads. At one point, around 30,000 warheads, and yet I believe our sustaining of deterrence and reassuring NATO allies proceeded successfully. And so the first thing I'd want to say to the first item on your list is that, yes, the issue is raised. It should be joined in close consultation, and we should be clear about that commitment. And I believe our commitment should be accepted. I just would stop there now.
Mm-hmm. Then on the human rights front, similar kind of 9 recommendations. Victor, anything there you would speak to in particular?
Probably the first two. I think benchmarking the human rights issue early is important. Again, we are in a political transition here in the United States. The North Korean Human Rights Act is going to be re-up next year. this this is a point where arguably also the momentum could stall um, if there is not attention to it. And so I think it's quite important for the president-elect to come out early to make a broader statement about commitment, U.S. commitment to Asia, but also to make a statement about the North Korea issue, about deterrence, and also about human rights. I think that's a very important message to send very early on. As you all know, the first 100 days of any administration is where all the policies, good or bad, their paths get set, and if they're on a good path, they move forward. If they're on a bad path, it takes a year to turn them around again. So it's very important, at least on these issues, I think, to make those sorts of statements early.
And in particular, because we found that the human rights issue is a point of sensitivity to Pyongyang in a way that other criticism has not been, right?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that North Korea doesn't like all the sanctions that are put upon it, either the unilateral sanctions. Unilateral is a loaded word. I mean, the sanctions that individual countries have put on the regime, as well as the UN Security Council sanctions, I think they don't like them, but at the same time, I think they wear them as a badge of honor, in the sense that you can put all these sanctions on us, we don't care, that sort of viewpoint. On the other hand, the human rights criticisms have bothered the regime. It's pretty obvious that it has bothered the regime. It has affected the way they've done their own diplomacy in Europe. It's affected the way they report on it, the statements that they've made, the direct protests that they've made to the State Department and other governments. Because I think it really, while other issues could be used for the purpose of, as we political scientists say, rally around the flag, it's hard to rally around the flag when people are saying that you don't treat your own people well. And I think it creates hypersensitivities in the regime, because the general public understands this, and at least some of the interviewing that we've done shows that the North Korean public is much more aware of the outside world, and much more aware that they've been given the short end of the stick, and that would be an understatement. And so I think for that reason, this issue does sort of sting the regime. Having said that, I think many people agree that the purpose of the human rights issue is not simply to try to hurt. I mean, it's not a tool solely for the purpose of trying to hurt the regime. I think there's a genuine feeling that this is a situation that is unacceptable, and that one should continue to work this issue. But for policymakers, for negotiators, there's obviously a new element to this problem that we had not appreciated before.
Can I pile on here a
Please.
little? So when I listen to this, and I'm less comfortable talking about human rights sanctions than I am talking about plutonium and highly enriched uranium, but it seemed to me that if you looked at the policy prescription of embracing sanctions, that those who favor sanctions have 1, 2, or 3 reasons, and maybe more, for wanting sanctions. The first is because the sanctions might actually impede their weapons programs. I mean, you might actually put on a sanction that cuts off access to some technology, equipment, or material that they need. Or you might just regard money as fungible, and anything that weakens their economy, weakens their capability to build weapons of mass destruction. So there's a material impact to sanctions, and I think we should be hard-nosed about trying to figure out how effective they've been in that connection. A second is that with Iran as a model, and it may be a terrible model for North Korea, but with Iran as a model, you wish, in fact, to cause pain that the regime feels, not just the young and the old and the weak, but the regime feels, so that you are motivating the DPRK to the negotiating table to have the sanctions lifted. Right? So it's a motivator for negotiations. That's a second. A third is, you may actually, and I'm tempted to say parenthetically, delude yourself, close parentheses, that you can bring down the regime with sanctions, that it will be so undercutting to the effectiveness of the regime that there will be a popular uprising, and you will have done this, caused regime change through sanctions. Now, the problem with all three, to some and to varying degrees, there are many problems. One of them is that North Korea is not Iran. It isn't hooked into the international economic community in quite the same way, hardly. But also there's China. And, Victor's already spoken effectively and intelligently to that. And China's interests are not congruent with our own, and they are going to be a thermostat on the effectiveness. And, if it gets too hot, they'll change the thermostat. Mm-hmm. Okay. What I'm concerned about is that, having said this, that those who favor sanctions have a fourth reason. It makes us feel good. We are doing something. Is it productive, though? And now we get to what really, I'm going to use a technical diplomatic term here, pisses off the North Koreans with respect to sanctions. I know this not only because I'd read this, but also I've had a senior, not too long ago, North Korean diplomat tell me this, that a sanction, human rights sanction, that names their leader, let's leave out whether he's a dear leader or not, but their leader, Kim Jong-un, is offensive. Now, when I say that, some people may be saying that's exactly what we were hoping for. We were hoping to offend them. All I'm suggesting and why I'm making this intervention here is because I want us to be smart. And by being smart, we want to look at the impact of our actions and whether we want to insult them. My comments do not go to whether this particular individual, who is the head of a hereditary regime in the DPRK, in some sense deserves the sanction. Forgive me for this, but I'm less interested in that than I am on the effect of the sanctions. And a particular thing that we know is insulting, whether that's what we wish to accomplish. All I'd ask is we think about that first.
Okay, well, if I can, I'd like to thank the Korea Society for having us here. If you're interested in reading the report, which I hope you are, you can find it on the Bush Center website, bushcenter.org/NK. It's available there for download as a PDF along with some other research. So thank you.
Well, thank you, Bob, Victor, and Lindsay, and for this very insightful presentation, a very, very nice historical framework that you put it in. This is the holiday season. It's not all that cheerful, given the both of you emphasized that the risk levels have risen and will continue to rise over the next several years on the peninsula. And also thank you, Lindsay, for introducing the Bush Institute for your commendable work there on human rights in North Korea. And then for the audience, I'd like to ask you to take the time to fill out our evaluation forms, and please hand them to Nikki and our interns who are around here. And one last announcement, we do have another program at noon today related to North Korea in general, right? What's the name of the program, Nikki?
James Church.
James Church, right, right. I don't know how many fiction, but based on fact, I think, or factual understandings. So thank you all for attending. Okay.